interviewed a robber in California who had used pipe bombs as diversion devices to draw law enforcement and fire to other locations, and then they engaged in bank robberies.
Welcome to RANE's podcast series, Insights on Security with Brian Lynch. Today, the topic is the behavioral attributes of the criminal or terrorist groups who carry out attacks, and how corporate security departments can manage those risks.
I am very pleased to have Dr. Kevin Kelm, President of Arson and Bombing Behavioral Analysis, a criminal forensics company, join us today. Kevin, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Brian. I appreciate the invitation very much. It's a pleasure.
For today's podcast, we are going to be discussing with Kevin behavioral attributes of both the criminal and terror actor who conduct bombings and or arson incidents. We'll get a little deeper into motivations and then focus on individual behaviors that should be of concern to not only corporate security departments, but all of us as they may unfold around us. So, Kevin, let me start with the differences that you have identified between the criminal actor and the terror group who conduct bombing and or arson incidents.
Okay, Brian. To answer your question, I think that what we see in the motivation behind a lot of these offenders, whether they're terrorists or criminals, is that their violence is motivated by either affective or instrumental goals and desires. It's a psychological need, and affective, I should say, is a psychological need, and it's desire-driven. And the instrumental actors, which tend to be the terrorists, are what we might consider rational, even though it's criminal in its nature and it's a terrorist act. There's some reason behind it that we can understand, and it's goal-driven. When we look at the criminals, their behavior tends to have the character of being a pseudo-genius. They do have higher IQs than some of the other offenders that we come across, and as a consequence, it gives them an inflated sense of their own abilities. And there's more risk-taking. We'll see things like devices that are hastily put together. They don't have any kind of safety mechanisms like arming switches. They'll take extreme risks even with the use of explosives. For example, oftentimes they'll use mixtures like flash powder, which is pressure, heat, shock, and static sensitive. And as a consequence, just even making, say, for example, a pipe bomb, if you screw the cap down too tight or have powder in the threads, you can blow yourself up. And they're somewhat mindless of that. Terrorists, on the other hand, tend to be more procedural. They use manuals and go-bys, whereas the criminals are offended by that notion. You ask them how they got their knowledge, and they think that they're smart enough to figure it out, and in fact, they generally are. I think I related the incident. I interviewed a bomber, and I asked him how he got the knowledge to make it, and he kind of looked at me very disgustedly and said, "Well, pipe, bomb, duh." And it kind of reflects that attitude that they have. Terrorists, on the other hand, like I said, use manuals and go-bys. They generally rely on a bomb maker who is different from the person who is actually deploying or implementing the device. And they employ safeguards primarily because what you have is a situation of bombs for dummies. The leaders and the bomb makers are not the ones who are using the devices. They let somebody else take the risks, and even in cases of suicide bombers, they talk them into doing it and give them instructions on how to use the bomb. So those people are removed from the actual activity, the terrorist activity. So I think that's kind of the big differences that we see behaviorally, and there's a lot of little things that we can look at, but that kind of gets the flavor of where we're coming from when we talk about these types of individuals.
Thanks, Kevin. So you provided kind of the structure of the difference between the two. Let me start with the criminal actor and the motivation behind the activities of this person. And frankly, focus on, if you can, if you will, please, the goal, and really looking for the factors that influence action. So they may think about doing some things or putting a pipe bomb together, but what is the action imperative? How does that cross that line?
Okay, well, that's a good question. And I think that, again, we go back to this notion of instrumental versus affective violence. And for the criminals that use the bomb as a tool, it's a weapon of choice. And the types of offenders that we see in this categorization would be things like criminal gangs, organized crime, extortionate behavior. Bikers are a good example. In fact, I can tell you from a personal experience where we investigated the Outlaws motorcycle gang in the upper Midwest back in the 90s. And a lot of people think that the largest vehicle bomb was in the World Trade Center and then in Oklahoma City, and they're correct. However, there was another vehicle bombing in Chicago where the Outlaws employed a 100-pound car bomb to destroy the clubhouse of the Hells Angels. So that was, again, gang violence, retaliatory. Another instance where they placed a bomb made out of a fire extinguisher in a vehicle in Rockford. The guy came out and started the vehicle and blew himself up. In a third incident, which is kind of funny, the Outlaws were trying to place a bomb underneath a vehicle in Minneapolis. And while one of the guys was underneath the vehicle placing the bomb, the other guy was in the truck messing with the remote control, and he actually detonated the bomb. The actor underneath was blown out from under the vehicle, lost his hat, some other items, which later tied him forensically to the crime. So he lost his hearing as well. It's kind of a funny incident. But they are used for the specific purpose as a tool or a weapon. I interviewed a robber in California who had used pipe bombs as diversion devices to draw law enforcement and fire to other locations, and then they engaged in bank robberies. They ultimately were involved in a police chase, and they started throwing pipe bombs at the police cars that were chasing them. So there's that instrumental tool for the bomb for criminals. Now, offenders that are affectively motivated, generally they're symptomatic with the mental disorder. Oftentimes, the disorders are related to delusional disorders. There's amount of paranoia. Frequently, you'll see schizophrenia, which is a mental disorder that's characterized by delusions and hallucinations. The delusions are a skewed worldview. And oftentimes when paranoia is added to that, it triggers a defense attack mechanism. That worldview, that paranoia makes them feel that people or situations or things are attacking them, and so they have to engage in defense, and in this case it's using bombs. It's a complicated, convoluted thought process. The other factor of that, the hallucinations, oftentimes these individuals may have imperative directions, oftentimes auditory, where voices tell them to do things. And sometimes we think that these people aren't able to function in society because of that, but in reality they can appear somewhat normal and function in society because sometimes those voices give them good ideas and they can follow through on their actions. This individual, this symptomatic mental disorder, are factors that really represent greater threats of violence and violent behavior. And I think another thing that characterizes these individuals quite often is the grievances. They're grievance collectors. They have things that happen to them and they feel victimized, and it's related to the paranoia. They feel like they're not being heard, and they want society or specific targets to give them what they want. This is very characteristic of bombers such as George Metesky, who was the Mad Bomber of New York in the 40s through the 50s, and Ted Kaczynski, the notorious Unabomber. They had grievances against, in Metesky's case, Con Edison Utility, but he eventually went on a campaign against the whole city of New York. And of course, Kaczynski bombed targets that he felt were related to technology and the aviation industry in society, which was what he wrote his manifesto about. The fact that they don't feel that they're being heard, the bomb is an ultimate weapon to use to get people to pay attention and listen to their message. And an example of this is Luke Helder, the so-called smiley face bomber, who in the early 2000s traveled all over the upper Midwest through Iowa and Nebraska and eventually into Colorado and Nevada. Supposedly making a smiley face on the map of the U.S. with bombs. But the thing that he, in his communications, the thing he described is that his bombs were attention getters. Pay attention to me. I'm using these to get your attention. And they don't feel that they're being heard. They want to be heard.
I'd like to stay on this topic a little bit and dig a little deeper for those corporate security and business leaders who are listening about the behaviors that should be of concern. I don't know if monitor is the right word, but they should be concerned about should they become aware of this type of behavior at their company. So let's talk a little bit, Kevin, in your experience, what should companies be concerned about on the part of their employees that are exhibiting certain behavioral traits, for example?
Okay, well, now we're getting into the domain of threat assessment and risk assessment, and it's important to distinguish the two because threats are they're operational, they're dynamic, they are emerging, they're ongoing, and those are situations where a company's threat assessment team and managers are evaluating an emerging threat, and may involve the police, and it requires some type of immediate intervention. Whereas when we do risk assessments from the perspective of evaluating someone, it's more of a judicial or mental health approach. And the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. There's a lot of time to be able to evaluate what's occurring. And from the corporate perspective, I think that risk assessment is looking at vulnerabilities and trying to harden the target and make sure that your company is not vulnerable to either external or internal risks. So, having said that, we go back to the threat assessment domain, and we're looking for these emerging threats, and this is something where people need to be aware of what's going on in their relationships with other people and identify things that just don't seem normal and are out of character. We have a tendency to keep our peace and to not voice our concerns. This is where the employees and managers need to be aware of the things that occur with the individuals who have the potential for pathways to violence. They have an intense focus on these things that trigger their paranoia and cause them to collect these grievances. They don't let things go, and they're not calm people. They're not people who will brush things off. They tend to really collect these grievances, as I've mentioned, and they are triggers for them. And when you start seeing that coinciding with things like fascination or interest with weapons, making threats, either direct or implied, having inappropriate comments and attempts at relationships with other employees, and then demeaning other people and devaluing other people. Those are pathways. And so I think that there's quite a bit out there that if a company doesn't have one, they should have a threat assessment team. And, be aware of a great deal of information out there. For example, there's the International Handbook of Threat Assessment by Malloy and Hoffman as editors, which is a really good resource. Another thing that I think, Brian, you and I have talked about before is there's a good book out there by Gavin DeBecker called The Gift of Fear. And, we talk about this primal midbrain that we have that enhances our survival instinct. And we tend to ignore it. When things happen that cause the hair on the back of our neck to go up, we need to pay attention to it because our body is trying to tell us something's not right. And we need to respond to that and act on it as opposed to letting our rational brain dismiss it. And this is certainly true in the workplace. The best defense against this are the employees who see these behaviors every day and need to report them and make sure that the company, the corporation is aware of it and can evaluate it and, if necessary, act on it.
Yeah, Kevin, great information. And let's put it onto the normal employee of a company that sees something odd about Johnny or Freddie over a period of time. What should that person do with that information, Kevin?
Well, I think it's important to report it. It's actually important to look at these as behavior that just isn't right. These individuals do not work and play well in the sandbox with everybody else. They are odd. I've mentioned Kaczynski before. He had an interesting history, brilliant. He had a PhD in mathematics, I believe, from Michigan, and he got a job as a teacher at Berkeley as a professor in mathematics, but he couldn't teach because he was so quirky and unusual and didn't get along well with people. And eventually left teaching, went to work for his brother, but he was a problem worker. He began to fixate on specific female employees that he thought he should have a romantic relationship with, and when they rejected him, he began writing dirty limericks about them and posting them on bulletin boards in the company. And when he was warned to stop, he just continued. In fact, the behavior escalated until his own brother had to fire him, and he went to live in the woods in Montana. So that oddity is something that needs to be compared or looked at. It's almost like in the movie Office Space, where the guy's obsessed about his stapler and eventually burns the company down. There's some truth in that. It's kind of funny when you watch that movie. But we're looking for these pathway warning behaviors, and that's any behavior that indicates that there's research, planning, preparation, or implementation of an attack. And some of that can be like a fixation on either an idea or a particular employee that can be someone that they'll identify as the source of their problem, and they just will not let it go even after they've been warned. We look for bursts of warning behaviors, some leakage where they make statements to the effect that they could come back and do damage, they could kill someone, somebody needs to die. They're see something on TV about a bombing and comment about it and mention that something like that could happen here. Those types of veiled threats that are specific should be of concern and need to be reported. That's just some of the things that we talk about. I think that this is, it's incumbent upon managers to not only have a risk assessment, and it's important for them to come up with a plan and to ensure that their employees are educated and understand these risks. Unfortunately, it's the society that we live in today. It can happen any place, and it's not just limited to bombings. We certainly have the situation with workplace violence involving active shooters. The same rules apply. Same things need to be considered when we deal with those situations.
Thanks, Kevin. And so what we're hearing is that if an employee who may be listening does either observe or is being told about behaviors and then obviously observes that type of behavior, it's okay to report that. And I think it's critically important that HR and other entities within a corporation make it that if you do report it, it's okay. It's not tattletaling. It's actually helping the firm. Could possibly help the firm get through a difficult situation. Let me ask you. You mentioned grievance collector, and we talked a little bit about that. Does it matter what the grievance is, Kevin?
No, and the thing is that sometimes the grievance just is irrational to the rest of us. It makes no sense to us. It makes perfect sense to that individual. And the grievance, like I said, real or imagined, it can make perfect sense to the individual. And I think I mentioned Metesky. He accused the Con Edison company of, quote, dastardly deeds, end quote. And it had to do with an injury that he suffered on the job and felt that the company had caused and didn't compensate him adequately for. And he waged a years-long campaign about this, whereas Kaczynski's a little bit more esoteric, that he felt that the airline industry in particular and society in general embracing technology was destroying the earth, and that he was there to call attention to this problem and his message, which again, if you read the manifesto, it's very convoluted, hard to understand. So yeah, you just can't dismiss these things that they fixate upon in their grievances, because again, the problem is dismissal. I think one of the greatest insults in life is to be ignored, and they certainly, as grievance collectors, take that very seriously, being ignored, and they're going to act upon it very violently.
Yes, very good advice. And if a company has identified a grievance collector, either someone who is currently onboarded or someone that has left the company, the grievance collector, in his or her mind, it doesn't matter whether they're currently employed or not, does it?
Oh, no, absolutely not. They'll take it with them. And in those situations where it becomes so much of a concern and the individual has exhibited significant warning factors, it could be time to not only get law enforcement involved, but also to do things like obtain restraining orders and orders prohibiting their presence or contact. And again, that's not a guarantee. It's not a safety measure. But what it does do is that when the individual continues their grievance and their contact, then it can be acted upon, and you can get some intervention. And in fact, there may be the possibility of mental health intervention once the authorities become involved. And the thing to remember is that this kind of is illustrated in stalking behavior. It's the same kind of thing that I want attention, and even if it's negative attention, it's still attention, and I want it one way or the other.
Yes, very, very interesting, Kevin. I think that this does show up in corporations. The grievance collector who may pick a very minute or small matter and make a mountain out of a molehill, as the old term goes, and then won't give it up. Well, let me ask you, if I'm a corporate security director and I'm listening to this, I obviously don't want to ignore it, because this is not going to go away, right? I mean, these things may percolate, but it's not going to go away. What are the steps that I should consider? Obviously, it's case by case, but from a broad brush perspective, well, what are the steps that I should consider once someone like this has been identified at my company?
Well, this is when we go back to the concept of threat assessment. Companies, particularly larger companies, should have a threat assessment team in place, and perhaps have the resources of a psychologist or psychiatrist on call through either a contractor arrangement or even in-house for some really big companies. And these threats that are brought to the attention of management, or these concerns that employees might have, kind of go up the food chain. Obviously it's a disciplinary problem. It's a work issue for a manager to deal with. The thing is that management can't gloss over it and minimize these things. The thing to remember with this grievance collecting is that it's caused by fixation. It's fixation on an idea, a delusion. These delusions are that I'm being victimized, I'm being persecuted, and they can't let it go. And when these situations get to that point, it needs to escalate to this threat assessment team to look at it and to start making evaluations based upon pathway behaviors. Looking at those symptomatic behaviors that we see, like novel aggression warnings that the people talk about. First-time violence, and all of a sudden their conversation and behaviors are totally extreme and move away from what normally expected from them. Things like identification warnings, where they have a warrior mentality or pseudo-commando, and they become associated with weapons and law enforcement or military paraphernalia, where they identify with previous attackers, like, say, Timothy McVeigh. It pops up in a conversation that would be somewhat unusual. And I mentioned leakage before. Last warning resorts. It's like, okay, either do it my way or else. Those are really things that should get the attention of management, of managers and the threat assessment team. Ultimately, it's the interventions that take place is that HR needs to be involved to have discussions with these individuals and to warn them about their behavior. The thing is to listen to their issues, to show that you are in fact paying attention. However, obviously some of these issues and demands are just unreasonable or illogical or non-existent. And, it could come to the showdown where it's like, we need to let you go. Those types of situations need to be handled in such a way that it does not escalate, and, particularly involving, say, for example, the individual focuses and indicates that their immediate supervisor is the problem, and that's who they fixate on, and that's the subject of their grievance. Obviously, that's not going to be the individual to terminate them. Or to discipline them. It needs to go to someone who is unrelated and isn't necessarily perceived as part of the big problem. And again, as I mentioned, if the behaviors get to the point that it becomes necessary to involve law enforcement or the courts, don't hesitate to do that. Managers should certainly be aware of what their potential legal remedies are, either criminal or civil, and should take advantage of that. And I hope that, it's kind of hard to say in specific detail when we're dealing with, like I said, these are emergent, operational, evolving, and dynamic situations. It's hard to come up with something concrete. There's a lot of information out there that's available to managers from publications available from the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA, the cybersecurity threats. There's plenty of information out there that can help guide managers. And of course, like I said, looking at the assistance of threat assessment professionals that can help guide this as well.
Yeah, Kevin, great advice, and the appropriate actions that you laid out, depending upon the case. I know that sometimes in companies they typically will move problem employees to different supervisors to try to get a different leader in front of the person. Has your experience shown, obviously we don't have a specific case, but does the grievance collector care who the supervisor is generally?
Well, again, as you said, case specific. I think it depends on what their perception of the problem is, or who their perception of the problem is, and if it gets to the point where it's the company, it really doesn't matter who they're talking to. Any minion, if you will, of the company is part of the problem. Again, I think it's the situation where we're talking about threat versus risk. We're looking at emergent situations, and we're looking for that symbolic risk. We're looking for their public statements, their anger, the cause of their problem, and if we can mitigate it by using either employees who are considered outsiders, or even go to the outside. And bring someone else in, whether it be the police or a threat assessment professional, to help work with them and through the company. Anything that you can do to de-escalate is always important, because we're trying to address those violence pathways, like the fixation, the anger, the unheard message. Delusional and paranoid behavior is hard to overcome. As soon as you counter and try to talk them out of their delusion, then you become part of the problem, and the paranoia kicks in and said, aha, there's another enemy. Sometimes it just cannot be overcome. And we need to look at things like social engineering and planning, where these individuals really start fixating on the notion that they're going to act in some way. So, who should deal with it? Again, situational. I think that, again, whoever can actively step in and intervene in a way that will de-escalate is always helpful. Sometimes it just isn't possible.
Yeah, great points, Kevin. And the final area that I'd like to discuss is, I think we touched upon this a little bit, but the problem doesn't go away if the person is removed from employment. Can you talk a little bit about how important the termination process is, what that looks like, and then just because the employee is not working for XYZ company doesn't mean that the problem has gone away?
No, it certainly doesn't. Again, depending on how big the threat, kind of determines the level of restriction or action. And like I said, it can go anywhere from just saying, turn in your badge and your keys, your ID badge and your keys, you're done. Please don't come back. We won't work against future employment. However, we can't give you a good recommendation. Those types of things to help mitigate the separation. In some cases, it might even be acceptable if the individual is not deemed to be the potential for extreme immediate violence, to just terminate by phone. We overlook the idea of those types of impersonal contacts as being less inflammatory as a face-to-face. So the potential for that, anything, like I said, that can de-escalate. In some cases, again, the termination might require serving papers, and to say that you are prohibited from coming back here. This is a restraining order. Please don't have any further involvement with the company, and if you do, then we will pursue prosecution or civil action. So, again, hard to come up with absolutes. These are dynamic, situational factors that need to be taken into account. And we like to use the term as structured professional judgment. The problem with these types of cases is that there really are no base rates. There's no collection of data to tell us exactly how to respond, and we don't know how many people respond well, how many people respond bad. So you can't rely on statistics. You have to rely upon the education and the experience and the considered judgment of the people who are involved. There are plenty of survey instruments out there that can be used to evaluate the potential threat from an individual, but ultimately it's a judgment call, and a lot of thought that goes into how to handle that termination process. The same thing that occurs in law enforcement when we're planning on interviews. We think about who should do it, where it should be done, the types of things that should be talked about, the things that should not be talked about because they're likely to result in the person shutting down. And the same factors come into play when we're dealing with the employee process and up to and including termination.
Sound points, and appreciate your insights and expertise on this topic today.
It's a pleasure, Brian. I really appreciate the invite. You're entirely welcome, and I'd love to talk to you again.
Kevin Kelm is the president of Arson and Bombing Behavior Analysis, LLC. Individuals and organizations turn to RANE for risk intelligence that cuts through the hype to focus on what they need to know, what to expect, and what to do. Subscribe to RANE's core membership and get our daily risk updates, weekly intelligence briefs, breaking alerts on important risk developments, and so much more. Find out how RANE can power your business to success at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. Thanks for listening.